Chronicle is not bound to candlelight or cobwebs. It awakens wherever memory trembles, beneath gas lamps or fluorescent hums, in dusty parish ledgers or blinking digital voids. It speaks where silence grows loudest, and where the forgotten slip through the seams of certainty. This is the account of Verity Langley, an archivist of absences. She spent her life chasing what others had misplaced, names, places, lives unremembered, until the Chronicle turned its page toward her, until her own name appeared in the ink. The rain had been falling for 17 days when Verity Langley first glimpsed her own extinction. She had built her career in the spaces between certainty and doubt, those yawning chasms where names disappeared like smoke, where families swore by children who had never drawn breath, where entire bloodlines evaporated from record and memory alike. The London Clarion paid her handsomely for these investigations, though her editor often muttered about morbid obsessions and unmarketable paranoia. In her cramped flat above Pendleton's Clockworks, where the constant tick-tick-tick of repairs seemed to count down to something unnamed, Verity maintained what she called the negative space. Red string connected photographs to dates, dates to addresses, addresses to the hollow-eyed relatives who insisted someone had existed where now there was only absence. The constables called it dangerous speculation. Her colleagues whispered about breakdown and unhealthy fixation. But Verity called it journalism. The footnote that would damn her arrived on a Tuesday, buried in the marginalia of an 1812 incident report concerning 3 sisters, the Ashworth girls, who had vanished from Mrs. Crowley's boarding house in Whitechapel. The report itself was standard. Statements from witnesses who could remember nothing, rooms found empty but undisturbed, no signs of struggle or flight. What caught Verity's attention was a line scrawled beneath Constable Hartwell's signature in fading brown ink. See Chronicle copy, secured with collection N12. God preserve us from the forgetting. The Chronicle. Not the Chronicle or the Morning Chronicle, just Chronicle, as if it were the only one that mattered, as if it were a proper noun that needed no article, like death or time. Her searches turned up nothing. No publication by that name in the newspaper registries. No mention in the periodical indices. The phrase simply hung there, orphaned and ominous. It took 3 weeks of cultivating contacts and calling in favours before Verity learned of the Meridian Collection, a private archive housed within the College of Antiquities, accessible only to approved scholars studying what the catalogue obliquely termed documentary anomalies. Verity had forged credentials before, a letterhead here, a signature there, and suddenly Dr. Victoria Langley of Oxford's Department of Historical Documentation had urgent need to examine collection N12. The College of Antiquities squatted like a limestone tumour in Bloomsbury, its Gothic revival spires clawing at the perpetually overcast sky. Inside, the corridors exhaled the scent of old leather and older secrets. Verity's footsteps echoed strangely, as if the building were larger on the inside than its exterior suggested. The Meridian Collection occupied a circular room in the building's heart, where tall windows filtered daylight through leaded glass thick with centuries of grime. Dust motes danced in the amber beams like tiny, trapped souls. And there, in a climate-controlled display case at the room's centre, sat the Chronicle. It was bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light. Not black exactly, but the colour of deep water at night. The cover bore no title, only a sigil impressed into the hide. Interlocking spirals that seemed to shift when observed peripherally, like a memory trying to surface from the depths of unconsciousness. Verity stared at it for a full minute, her breath fogging the glass. Something about the book's presence felt aware, not malevolent precisely, but conscious in the way that predators are conscious of prey. She didn't touch the case. She didn't even photograph it. She simply looked and left, and tried to convince herself that the sensation of being observed was merely her imagination running wild. That night, she dreamed of pages turning themselves. She stood in a vast library where the shelves stretched upward beyond sight, filled with books that whispered to each other in languages that predated human speech. In the centre of this impossible space sat the Chronicle, open now, its pages fluttering though no wind stirred the air. As she approached, words began appearing on the visible pages, not printed, but growing like ink stains spreading through paper. Names, hundreds of them, written in dozens of different hands across centuries of script styles. Some were crossed out with heavy black lines, others had faded to ghostly grey. A few pulsed with fresh wetness, as if the ink had never quite dried. And there, in the margin of a page near the book's centre, in a hand she recognised as her own despite never having written it, Verity Langley. She woke at 3:17 a.m. with the taste of old paper in her mouth and the sound of her name still echoing in the silence of her flat. The sensation was so vivid that she reached for the bedside lamp, certain she would find the Chronicle open beside her pillow. Instead, she found her notebook, the leather-bound journal where she recorded her thoughts and leads, lying open to a page she had never written. At the top, in spidery Victorian copperplate, Verity Langley. In the margin, the same hand, investigative journalist, the London Clarion. And beneath that, in block letters that seemed carved rather than written, recorded. She tore the page out with shaking fingers and held it to the lamplight, searching for any explanation. Invisible ink, impressions from previous pages, anything rational. But the paper showed no signs of forgery or trickery. The ink had the settled quality of age, as if it had been there for years. The following morning brought a London thick with fog and heavy with the promise of rain. Verity's reflection in the mirror seemed somehow flattened, less dimensional than it should be. She attributed this to lack of sleep and too much coffee, though she noted the observation in her journal with the same methodical precision she applied to all her cases. The archive was busier this time. 3 other researchers hunched over manuscripts at reading tables, their faces pale in the filtered light. The archivist, a cadaverous man named Wickham, whose spectacles were so thick they rendered his eyes fish-like and distorted, glanced up from a pile of medieval tax records. "Back again, Dr. Langley? The Chronicle has been quite active since your visit." "Active?" Wickham adjusted his spectacles with the careful precision of a man handling delicate machinery. "New entries. 3 names appeared overnight. 2 from the 18th century, 1 more recent. We've never been able to determine how it updates itself." The book was temporarily archived in the collection in 1847, following its recovery from the estate of one Professor Aldrich Blackwood, a man whose writings hinted at a growing obsession with documentary consciousness before his mysterious disappearance. The Chronicle vanished from the archive shortly afterward. Though rumours persist, it never truly left. The Chronicle now lay open on Wickham's desk, its pages spread to reveal columns of names in various states of legibility. The book was larger than Verity remembered, thicker, as if pages had been added in the night, and there, 3rd entry from the top of the right-hand page, Verity Langley. Not in her handwriting this time, but in the same copperplate script she'd found in her notebook. Below it, in smaller text, B 1987, Netherbury, specialist in unexplained disappearances. "Has this always been here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. Wickham leaned forward, his magnified eyes examining the page. "Of course, though I must say it's unusual to encounter someone whose name appears in the Chronicle while they're still present. Most of the recorded individuals prove quite difficult to verify historically." "What do you mean?" "Birth records, death certificates, census data. They often seem to be missing or contradictory, as if these people existed in the spaces between official documentation." He smiled thinly. "Rather like your area of expertise, wouldn't you say?" Verity left the archive with the Chronicle's image burned into her retinas. She tried calling the office, but her direct line went to voicemail. Not her own voice, but a generic message stating that extension was currently unassigned. At the Clarion building, her keycard beeped angrily at the turnstiles. Security looked at her with polite confusion. "I'm sorry, miss, but this card isn't active in our system." "That's impossible. I work here. I'm Verity Langley. Investigative. I'll need to see some identification." She fumbled for her wallet, extracted her press credentials. The security guard studied them with growing bewilderment. "Ma'am, this card expired 3 years ago, and we don't have any employee by this name in our current directory." The elevator ride to the newsroom floor passed in a haze of disbelief. Surely this was some kind of elaborate prank, or a computer system error, or... Her desk was gone. Not empty. Gone. The entire workstation had been removed, replaced by a potted plant and a small table bearing outdated magazines. Her nameplate, her computer, her carefully organized files on dozens of active cases, all vanished as if they had never existed. "Can I help you?" The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, the crime reporter who had worked, 3 desks over from hers. "Marcus, it's me, Verity. What happened to my desk?" He studied her face with the polite attention given to strangers who might be slightly unwell. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" "I'm Marcus Webb, crime desk." "We've worked together for 4 years. You borrowed my notes on the Pemberton disappearance just last week." Marcus glanced around the newsroom as if seeking assistance. "Miss, I think there might be some confusion. I've been at this paper for 8 years, and I've never worked with anyone by that name. Are you sure you have the right publication?" The editor's office occupied a glass-walled corner of the newsroom, its windows now blind with condensation despite the absence of any apparent temperature differential. Harold Grimsby had hired Verity personally, had praised her work publicly, had argued with the publisher to give her better assignments and higher pay. He looked at her now as if she were a door-to-door salesperson who had somehow breached building security. "I'm sorry. Have we met? I'm rather busy at the moment." "Harold, it's Verity Langley. I've worked for you for 4 years. You assigned me the Ashworth sisters case just last month." Grimsby's face underwent a subtle transformation, not recognition exactly, but the careful wariness of a man trying to determine if he was dealing with delusion or con artistry. "Miss Langley, I think there's been some misunderstanding. I don't recall assigning any such case, and I certainly don't have any investigative journalists by that name on staff. Perhaps you're thinking of another publication." She tried logging into her computer account from a public terminal. "User not found." Her email address bounced back messages marked, "Delivery failed. Mailbox does not exist." The Clarion's online archive, when searched for her byline, returned no results. Not even the negative space of deleted articles. Simply nothing. As if her 4 years of work had never been written. The records office at Somerset House occupied a building that seemed designed to crush human spirits through architectural oppression alone. Behind bulletproof glass, Clerks processed requests for births, deaths, and marriages with the enthusiasm of pallbearers. Birth certificate for Verity Langley, born June 15, 1987, in Netherbury, Dorset. The clerk, a middle-aged woman whose expression suggested she found existence itself vaguely disappointing, typed with the precise rhythm of a funeral march. No record found. Are you certain of the spelling? Of course I'm certain. It's my name. More typing. A frown. No record of anyone by that name born in Netherbury on that date. In fact, no record of anyone named Langley born in Netherbury in the 1980s at all. That's impossible. The clerk's frown deepened. Miss, I'm looking at the official register. If you're not in here, then either your information is incorrect or what? The woman's eyes met hers through the bulletproof glass, and for just a moment, Verity saw something that might have been sympathy. Or, you were never born. The train to Dorset departed Paddington Station at 2:15 p.m., threading through countryside that grew increasingly unfamiliar as miles accumulated. Fields and hedgerows that should have triggered childhood memories remained stubbornly anonymous. The landscape itself seemed to be forgetting her even as she travelled through it. Netherbury had always been small, barely a village really, just a collection of cottages clustered around a Norman church and a single pub. Verity's grandmother had lived there until her death in 2003, in a stone cottage with a garden where hollyhocks grew wild and the scent of lavender hung heavy in summer air. The bus from Dorchester meandered through valleys that grew more alien with each turning. When the driver announced Netherbury, Verity looked out at a landscape that bore no resemblance to her memories. Water stretched from horizon to horizon, a vast artificial lake reflecting the grey sky like a mirror. A few stone foundations poked above the surface near the shore, remnants of walls and chimneys that had once sheltered human lives. "Excuse me," Verity called to the driver. "This isn't Netherbury." The man glanced at her in his rearview mirror. "Aye, it is, or was, rather. Been under water since they built the reservoir in 1962. Lovely spot for fishing now, though most folks say the water's too cold for swimming. But I was born here. I lived here until I was 12. Sorry, love, but that's not possible. Village was evacuated in 61, demolished the following spring. Made quite a fuss in the papers at the time. Families who'd lived there for generations, forced to relocate for the greater good and all that. Last residents moved out 43 years ago. Verity stared at the water, searching for some landmark that would make sense of this impossibility. In the distance, the tip of a church spire broke the surface like a stone finger pointing accusingly at the sky. She knew that spire. Had thrown stones at the weather vane when she was 7 and her grandmother wasn't watching. Had hidden behind the churchyard wall during games of hide-and-seek with children, whose names she could almost remember. "Could you let me off here?" The driver shrugged. "Nothing here but water and ghosts. But it's your funeral." The bus pulled away with a belch of diesel exhaust, leaving Verity alone on a gravel verge that ended at a concrete boat ramp. The water lapped quietly against the artificial shore, making sounds like whispered conversations in languages she couldn't quite understand. She walked to the water's edge and peered into the depths. Beneath the surface, she could make out the ghostly outlines of streets and gardens, the skeletal remains of a life that everyone insisted had never existed. Her reflection wavered in the dark water, and for just a moment it seemed to mouth words she couldn't hear. The return journey to London passed in a haze of unreality. Verity found herself checking her reflection in the train windows, noting how it seemed less substantial than it should be, as if she were becoming translucent. Other passengers' eyes seemed to slide over her without quite focusing, the way one might look through rather than at a piece of furniture. Her flat above Pendleton's clockwork still existed, though Mrs. Pendleton looked at her strangely when she climbed the narrow stairs. "Excuse me, dear, but who are you? I don't recall renting the upstairs to anyone." "I've lived here for 3 years. I pay rent on the 1st of every month." Mrs. Pendleton, a woman whose age seemed to shift depending on the light, consulted a ledger she produced from behind the shop counter. "According to my records, the flat's been empty since my previous tenant moved out in 2019. Lovely girl she was. Studied journalism, I think. Can't recall her name now, though." Inside the flat, Verity's conspiracy wall had changed. The photographs remained, but the faces in them were subtly different, blurred, as if the camera had moved during exposure. The red string connections she had so carefully mapped now led to blank spaces on the wall, connected to nothing. Her notebook lay open on the kitchen table. Every page that had once contained her handwriting was now blank, though the impressions of words remained like ghost images pressed into the paper. Only one entry survived, written in that same Victorian copperplate. "The names in the Chronicle are not recorded because they disappeared. They disappear because they are recorded. The act of documentation becomes the act of erasure. To be remembered officially is to be forgotten truly. Fee. L. Netherbury no longer exists. Neither do I." That night, her dreams took her back to the impossible library. The Chronicle sat open on its pedestal, but now she could see that it wasn't simply a record of disappearances. It was the mechanism by which they occurred. Each name written in its pages was a person being slowly edited out of reality, their existence transferred from the world into the book's hungry pages. She approached the Chronicle with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. The page containing her name had grown more detailed since her last dream. Verity Langley, born 1987, Netherbury, location archived. Investigative journalist specializing in unexplained disappearances. Unmarried, no children, no surviving relatives. Employment history, London Clarion, publication archived. Current status, documentation in progress. As she watched, new text appeared beneath her entry. Subject displaying awareness of process. Recommend acceleration of archival protocols. She woke to find her shadow missing. The absence wasn't immediately obvious. Shadows are background elements, noticed only when they behave unusually. But as Verity moved through her flat in the pre-dawn darkness, she realized that her body was casting no darkness on the walls, no silhouette on the floor. Light passed through the space she occupied, as if she were made of glass. Her reflection, too, had begun to lag. In the bathroom mirror, her image moved a fraction of a second behind her actual movements, like a badly dubbed film. When she raised her hand, her reflection waited a heartbeat before responding. When she turned her head, the mirror Verity turned in the wrong direction entirely. The city itself seemed to be rejecting her presence. Turnstiles at the underground stations wouldn't register her Oyster card. Automatic doors remained closed when she approached. Baristas looked through her when she tried to order coffee, their eyes focusing on points just to the left or right of where she stood. By afternoon, she had become effectively invisible to electronic systems. Cash machines wouldn't read her cards. Her phone couldn't connect to any network. Online, every account she tried to access returned the same message. User not found. The final pilgrimage to the College of Antiquities took place under a sky the colour of old pewter. The building's Gothic facade seemed more pronounced than before, its spires and gargoyles leering down at the pedestrians below, with expressions of Baroque malevolence. Inside, the Meridian Collection's circular room was empty, except for Wickham, who sat slumped over his desk in an attitude of defeat. When Verity entered, he looked up with eyes that held no recognition, not confusion, but the complete absence of memory that comes when a person's existence has been thoroughly erased from the observer's experience. "I'm sorry, miss, but the archive is closed to unauthorized personnel." "It's me. Dr. Langley. I was here yesterday asking about the Chronicle." Wickham's face underwent a subtle transformation, not recognition returning, but the dawning awareness that something was deeply wrong with the world around him. The Chronicle? But that's impossible. The Chronicle was never meant to be viewed by... He paused, his train of thought derailing as it encountered the gap where Verity's existence should have been. "I'm sorry, but who are you exactly?" The display case that had once housed the Chronicle stood empty, its glass surfaces reflecting nothing but the room around them. But on Wickham's desk, the book lay open, its pages moving gently as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. Verity approached slowly, aware that each step brought her closer to some final, irreversible threshold. The Chronicle's pages were covered with names now, hundreds of them, thousands, stretching back through centuries of documentation and erasure. Near the bottom of the visible page, in fresh ink that seemed to pulse with its own dark light, Verity Langley, investigative journalist, London Clarion. Status: integration complete. New assignment: archivist, Meridian Collection. Specialty: documentation of erasures. As she watched, more text appeared. First case assignment: Elias Nocturne, amateur occultist. Subject has begun investigating disappearances connected to antiquarian texts. Immediate archival recommended. Something moved in her peripheral vision, a shape that might have been human, or might have been shadow, or might have been the negative space where a person should be. When she turned to look directly, nothing was there. But she could feel a presence beside her, and when she looked at the Chronicle again, she could see that another hand was resting on the page opposite hers, translucent, barely visible, but unmistakably real. "Welcome to the collection," said a voice that might have been whispered by paper or breathed by ink. "You'll find the work quite engaging. After all, someone must document the spaces between what was and what is remembered." Verity tried to speak, to scream, to protest this impossible transformation, but found that her voice had become part of the Chronicle's whispered chorus. Her body was fading now, becoming translucent, but her consciousness remained sharp and focused with the clarity that comes from understanding one's true purpose. She was no longer Verity Langley, investigative journalist for the London Clarion. That person had never existed, had been nothing more than a clerical error in reality's vast filing system. She was now the archivist of erasures, keeper of the negative space, guardian of the spaces where forgotten people waited to be remembered by no one at all. Her first assignment lay open before her: Elias Nocturne, whose name had already begun appearing in the Chronicle's hungry pages. In London's fog-shrouded streets, a young antiquarian researcher was beginning to notice that certain books seemed to read themselves, that certain names appeared in documents he'd never opened, that his own reflection sometimes moved independently of his actions. The Chronicle was always hungry, and the collection was always expanding. In the space between documentation and extinction, Between memory and forgetting, the work continued as it always had, as it always would. World without end. Name without name. Amen. Verity Langley no longer exists. Not in records, not in memory. She has become something more enduring and far more perilous. A keeper of silence, an archivist of erasures. The Chronicle remembers her because nothing else can. As for the case she was assigned next, well, the ink has only just begun to dry. And somewhere in a shadowed room, another page turns. The Chronicle is always watching, and the collection is always expanding.